In some parts of the United States, farmers have started doing something pretty strange. They bring huge bags of wool out to their fields. Not fabric, not yarn, just rough, raw wool, straight from freshly sheared sheep. And instead of sending it to factories or trying to sell it, they do something that looks almost ridiculous from the outside. They bury it right in the ground. Sometimes it's just small sections of land. Other times, it's entire fields. After the wool is spread out and covered with soil, the field looks completely normal again. Nothing seems different. It looks like farmers simply buried a pile of junk. If you hear about this for the first time, it sounds almost absurd. Sheep wool has always been seen as a material for clothing. It's used to make sweaters, carpets, blankets. Normally it's cleaned, processed, and turned into fabric. But here, none of that is happening. No one is trying to turn this wool into textiles. No one is preparing it for industry. They just bury it. Sometimes we're talking about tens of tons of wool. Sometimes entire truckloads simply disappear under the soil. And the strangest part is that farmers don't do this once as an experiment. They keep repeating it again and again. From the outside, it almost looks like people found the easiest way to get rid of a waste product. Just hide it underground. But after some time, something unexpected begins to happen on those fields. And that's when it becomes clear that the farmers weren't burying wool for no reason. Let's start with a simple question. Why did farmers begin looking for solutions like this in the first place? In many agricultural regions across the United States, soil has slowly been losing its fertility. Land that has been used to grow crops for decades begins to change over time. Every harvest removes nutrients from the ground. Every season of cultivation breaks down the structure of the soil. And if that process continues long enough, the land starts behaving differently. It becomes poorer. Farmers in different states began noticing the same problem. Fields that once held moisture after rain or irrigation started drying out much faster. Water would either soak deeper into the ground or evaporate from the surface. Sometimes, just a day after irrigation, the top layer of soil would already feel dry and hard again. This became especially noticeable in the drier parts of the country. Take California, for example. Huge areas of the state are used for agriculture, but drought has become one of the biggest challenges over the past few decades. In some regions, there's very little rain for most of the year. Farmers depend heavily on irrigation systems, reservoirs, and groundwater. But even when water is available, the soil doesn't always hold it the way it used to. Similar patterns have appeared in other western states as well: Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Texas. Many of these places have always had dry climates, but modern agriculture has put even more pressure on the land. The more harvests farmers try to pull from the same fields, the faster the soil loses organic matter. And organic matter is what largely determines whether soil is truly alive. Healthy soil contains plant material, microbes, tiny organisms, and a complex structure that holds both water and nutrients. But when organic matter declines, the soil starts to compact. It doesn't absorb water as well. It holds moisture poorly, and plants have a harder time growing. Farmers sometimes describe this kind of land in very simple terms. They say the soil becomes dead. That doesn't mean nothing can grow there at all, but the land no longer works the way it once did. To produce the same harvest, farmers have to add more fertilizer, water their fields more often, and spend more resources. And while farmers were trying to figure out how to bring life back into the soil, something else was happening in agriculture. Something that didn't seem connected at first. It had to do with sheep. In the United States, sheep have been raised for more than 200 years, especially in western states like Texas, Wyoming, Colorado, Montana, and California. Every year, farmers shear millions of sheep, and every shearing produces the same thing: huge amounts of wool. At one time, this wool was a valuable resource. It was used to make clothing, carpets, blankets, and even military uniforms. During the first half of the 20th century, American wool was an important part of the country's textile industry. But over time, the situation began to change. Synthetic materials started appearing. Polyester, acrylic, and other synthetic fibers turned out to be cheaper, easier to produce, and simpler to care for. Gradually, they began replacing natural wool in everyday clothing. Large textile factories started closing or switching to different materials. And in the end, something unusual happened. Sheep are still raised in the United States. They still have to be sheared every year. It's necessary for the animal's health. But the wool itself has become far less valuable than it once was. Sometimes the wool sells for so little that it barely covers the cost of shearing, and that creates an odd situation. After shearing, farmers are left with tons of wool that are difficult to sell. Processing it requires transporting it long distances and paying additional costs. In many cases, it's simply cheaper to get rid of it. There weren't many good options. Huge bags filled with coarse fiber weren't something buyers were eager to purchase. Yes, some wool was exported overseas for processing. Some was used for insulation materials or garden mulch, but that wasn't enough to absorb the entire supply. As a result, agriculture unexpectedly ended up facing two problems at the same time. On one side, soil that is slowly losing organic matter and becoming worse for growing crops. On the other side, huge volumes of a material that almost nobody wants. And that's when someone had an unusual idea to combine these two problems. Because sheep wool isn't just a fiber used to make clothes. Essentially, wool is an organic material. It's made mostly of keratin, a protein that contains nitrogen, sulfur, and carbon. All of these elements play an important role in the soil. They help plants grow and support the microorganisms that live in the soil. So, in one sense, adding wool to the soil actually seems fairly logical. But at the same time, the idea sounds a little strange. After all, wool isn't compost, and it isn't a typical fertilizer. Still, it has several properties that immediately caught researchers' attention. And that's what eventually led to the first experiments. Researchers began taking raw wool, the same wool left over after sheep were sheared, and adding it to the soil on small test plots. Sometimes the wool was shredded. Sometimes it was simply buried directly in the soil in thick layers. The goal was fairly simple: to see whether the soil would change. Would it hold more water? Would its structure improve? And would plants grow better under those conditions? No one really expected any major results, but the wool managed to surprise them. When wool is buried in the soil, the changes don't happen instantly. During the first weeks, almost nothing is noticeable. From above, the field looks exactly the same as before. But beneath the surface, the soil slowly begins to behave differently. One of the first changes has to do with how the soil keeps its structure. In many agricultural regions, soil gradually becomes compacted over time. Soil particles become compressed, leaving less space between them. Because of that, water and air move through the soil less easily, and plant roots have a harder time growing. When wool is added to the soil, the situation slowly begins to change. The fibers act like a framework inside the ground. They create small pockets of space between the soil particles. Each of these spaces is small, but there are many of them, and together, they begin to change the structure of the soil. It becomes looser. As a result, air can move through the soil more easily. Plant roots can spread in different directions more freely. And when water enters the soil, for example after rain or irrigation, it spreads more evenly. These changes are especially noticeable in soils that have been used for agriculture for a long time. But the changes aren't only physical. Over time, the wool slowly begins to break down. This process is driven by soil microorganisms, bacteria and fungi that feed on organic material. They gradually break apart the fibers and incorporate them into the soil's natural cycle. As this happens, microbial activity increases. And microbial life is one of the main things that determines whether soil remains alive. The more of these organisms exist in the soil, the faster organic matter is broken down, and the more nutrients become available for plants. Gradually, a clearer picture begins to emerge. A material that was once considered almost useless waste starts working as part of the soil ecosystem. It doesn't act instantly like a chemical fertilizer. Its effect appears slowly, but that slow process turns out to be one of its advantages. The soil changes gradually, and those changes can last for a long time. But that wasn't all. Fairly quickly, attention shifted to something else: the plants. On test plots, researchers began comparing fields with wool in the soil and fields without it. They planted the same crops, used the same amount of water and fertilizer, and then observed the results. After some time, differences began to appear. On plots where wool had been added to the soil, plants often started growing faster. In some cases, they grew a little taller. In others, they formed denser root systems. It didn't happen instantly, and it didn't look like some dramatic change, but the difference still became noticeable. For example, in some field experiments, researchers reported that crop yields could increase by several dozen% compared to control plots. The exact results depended on the type of soil, the amount of wool added, and the specific crop being grown. But the overall pattern was similar. The fields simply began working more efficiently. In some cases, farmers noticed another detail as well. Fields where wool had been added to the soil were able to retain moisture longer between irrigations. That meant plants experienced less stress during hot periods. And for agriculture, that matters a lot. Because when a plant constantly lacks water, it spends energy trying to survive rather than growing. But when conditions remain more stable, crops can develop faster and produce larger harvests. Gradually, a new idea started to take shape. Sheep wool might not only improve soil structure, it could also become a tool for restoring land that has been used for farming for a long time and has started losing its productivity. And here, the paradox of this story appears again. Something that was long considered a useless byproduct of livestock farming begins to play a role in restoring agricultural land. To understand why this idea attracted so much attention, you have to look at a map of the western United States. Many of the country's major agricultural regions are found here. California, for example, produces a huge share of the fruits, vegetables, and nuts that are sold across the country. But the climate of this region depends heavily on irrigation. Without water from rivers and reservoirs, much of this land would simply be too dry for intensive farming. A similar situation exists in other states. In Arizona and New Mexico, rainfall is much lower than in the eastern United States. Summers are hot, and the soil loses moisture quickly. Farmers have to rely on irrigation to maintain their crops. And in regions like these, soil conditions become especially important. If the ground doesn't hold moisture well, water quickly disappears after irrigation. That means fields have to be watered more often, and the more irrigation is used, the faster water resources are used up. Over the past few decades, this problem has become especially noticeable in the western United States. In some areas, groundwater levels have been slowly declining. In California, for example, farmers in certain valleys have already started facing limits on how much water they can use. In other places, droughts are becoming more common. Because of that, any method that helps soil hold moisture longer begins to look like a potential solution. If the soil can keep water even a little longer, plants get more stable conditions for growth, and farmers may be able to reduce how often they need to irrigate. That's why experiments using wool attracted particular interest from farmers in dry regions. The idea turned out to be surprisingly simple. Instead of looking for complicated technological solutions, farmers could use a material that already exists in agriculture and is often treated as waste. And in some cases, that alone can be enough to change the way soil behaves. But to understand why this idea became possible in the first place, you have to look at the scale of wool production. As I mentioned earlier, millions of sheep are sheared every year in the United States. Even with relatively modest flocks, each shearing produces several pounds of wool from a single animal. As a result, tens of thousands of tons of raw wool are produced in the country every year. In the past, most of this wool went to the textile industry. Today, the situation is different. Some wool is still used to produce fabrics and carpets, but a large portion turns out to be too coarse or too expensive to process. This is especially true for wool from meat sheep breeds, which are raised for meat rather than for textile quality fiber. As a result, farmers often find themselves facing two problems at the same time: piles of unwanted wool and soil that has been losing its quality. So when you put those two things together, a new kind of logic begins to appear. Farmers suddenly have access to a cheap organic material that can be used directly on the land, without complicated processing or long-distance transport. And that's exactly why interest in experiments like this has gradually started to grow. Today, the idea of burying sheep wool in soil is still relatively new, but it is gradually moving beyond university experiments. In different parts of the United States, farmers have already begun trying it on real farms. For example, in some farms in California, wool is being used in vineyards and vegetable fields. Farmers mix it into the soil before planting crops or while preparing the fields. In the dry areas of the Central Valley, farmers are constantly looking for ways to improve soil conditions and hold moisture longer. So experiments like this are attracting more and more attention. Similar projects are appearing in other western states as well. In Wyoming and Colorado, where sheep ranching remains an important part of agriculture, research groups have begun working directly with local ranches. They are testing different ways of using wool, from shredded fibers mixed into the soil to special pellets made from compressed wool. The volumes are still relatively small, but they are gradually increasing. Some farms use dozens of tons of wool each year on specific plots of land. In university pilot projects, the numbers sometimes reach hundreds of tons of material spread across several experimental fields. For example, in a number of agricultural trials, researchers applied between 1 and several tons of wool per acre of soil. That amount might sound large, but in the scale of sheep farming, it represents only a small portion of the raw wool that appears each year after animals are sheared. All of this doesn't mean that wool will completely change the country's agriculture, but it has become another tool that farmers can use to work with their soil.